The soft hum of my office printer filled the room as I read the loan file and saw my own name listed where my son had placed it without asking. As I straightened the page instead of raising my voice, I let that hum steady my hands and keep my face calm. While the printer continued its patient rhythm, the sound grew heavier, like years of trust being processed line by line. The same hum followed my thoughts, reminding me how often I'd covered his mistakes with silence. That's when I understood this wasn't ambition. It was entitlement wearing family loyalty as a mask. Still, I shut the file knowing the justice would be quiet, and it would begin by removing my name from his future. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. The house was unusually quiet that evening, the kind of silence George had learned to appreciate over the years. The Chicago skyline glowed faintly through the living room windows, distant traffic humming like white noise. George sat in his leather chair with a cup of untouched coffee cooling on the side table, reviewing emails on his tablet, content in the calm routine he'd built for himself. At 58, he valued these quiet nights. No surprises, no chaos, just the reward of decades of disciplined work. The calm broke when Andrew appeared in the doorway. George looked up and immediately sensed something was off. His son didn't sit down. He hovered, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, hands rubbing together like he was warming them over an invisible fire. "Dad, you got a minute?" Andrew asked, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. George gestured toward the couch. "You look like you're about to ask me for something expensive." Andrew laughed too quickly and finally sat. "Actually, yeah, kind of." The words came fast after that, as if Andrew was afraid momentum was the only thing keeping the request alive. He explained there was a business opportunity, time-sensitive, high upside, the kind of deal that didn't come around twice. All he needed was a loan to secure it. A big loan, one that required a cosigner. George listened without interrupting, his expression neutral but his instincts were already stirring. "How big are we talking?" he asked when Andrew paused for breath. Andrew named the number. George didn't react outwardly, but inside his jaw tightened. "And the business?" George asked calmly. "Who's involved? What's the structure? What's your exit if it goes sideways?" Andrew leaned back, exhaling sharply. "Dad, it's solid. I've done the research. I just need your name to make the bank comfortable." "My name isn't a formality," George replied. His voice stayed even, but there was steel underneath it. "It's my credit, my assets, my future." Andrew's patience began to fray. "You always taught me to take risks. This is me doing that." "I taught you to take calculated risks," George said, "with your own skin in the game." Andrew waved a hand dismissively. "You're overthinking it. The bank just needs reassurance. Once the deal closes, it won't even matter." That was the moment George felt the unease settle in his chest. Not fear, something colder. He studied his son's face, searching for confidence, for clarity. What he saw instead was urgency bordering on desperation. "Let me see the paperwork," George said after a long pause. Relief flashed across Andrew's face. "Of course, I'll send it tonight." Andrew left soon after, his energy dissipating the second the ask was out in the open. George sat alone again, staring at the darkened television screen, replaying the conversation. He told himself this was what fathers did: listen, guide, protect. Still, sleep came slowly that night. Morning light spilled across the kitchen counter as George opened his laptop with a cup of fresh coffee. Andrew had sent the documents late the night before. George scrolled methodically, eyes trained to catch details others missed. Then he froze. There it was, borrower information, guarantor section. His name, typed neatly into fields he had never authorized. Not blank, not pending, entered. George leaned back, the air suddenly heavy. He scrolled again, slower this time, hoping he'd misread it. He hadn't. A tight pressure formed behind his eyes, Not confusion, not shock, but something far more personal. Betrayal. His mind raced through the implications, the assumptions Andrew must have made, the quiet decision to move forward without consent. This wasn't a misunderstanding, it was a choice. George closed the laptop carefully, as if any sudden movement might shatter what little restraint he had left. He stared out the window at the city he'd spent his life building a place in, realizing that the threat hadn't come from a competitor or a bad deal, but from his own son. And for the first time since Andrew was a boy, George didn't know how to protect them both at the same time. George didn't wait long before calling. The moment the house settled into morning stillness again, he picked up his phone and dialed Andrew's number. He expected hesitation on the other end, maybe guilt, maybe an apology that came too quickly. What he didn't expect was how fast Andrew answered, or how guarded his voice sounded. "Dad," Andrew said, "what's up?" George didn't waste time. "I reviewed the loan documents." A pause, brief but telling. "And?" Andrew asked, already bracing. "And my name is on them," George said. "Not as a possibility, not as pending approval, it's already there." Andrew exhaled sharply, irritation creeping in. "Okay, yeah, but that's not what it looks like." "Then explain it," George said, his grip tightening around the phone. Andrew's tone shifted, defensive now. "It was just preliminary paperwork. The bank need S to C intent. I figured once you looked it over, we'd finalize it together." "You figured," George repeated. "You didn't ask." Andrew scoffed. "Dad, come on. It's not like I forged your signature, it's just your name." That sentence landed harder than Andrew seemed to realize. "Just my name," George said quietly. "That name took me 30 years to build. That name carries everything I own." Andrew pushed back immediately. "You're blowing this out of proportion. I honestly didn't think it would be a big deal." George felt heat rise in his chest, not explosive anger, but something sharper, more controlled. "You didn't think it was a big deal to tie me to a loan I never agreed to." "It's for the family," Andrew said, leaning into the argument. "This deal sets us up long-term. You always talk about legacy. This is part of that." George stood and walked to the window, staring out at the street below. Cars moved steadily, people going about lives untouched by the fracture forming in his own home. "Don't turn this into something noble," he said. "You didn't do this for legacy. You did it because you needed leverage." Andrew's voice hardened. "I needed help." "Then you should have asked," George replied, "not assumed." The silence that followed felt heavier than shouting ever could. When Andrew spoke again, his words came slower, more calculated. "Look, Dad, if you just let this ride, nothing bad happens. The deal closes, the loan gets serviced, and your name never even comes up again. It's a small favor." George closed his eyes. There it was, the manipulation wrapped in reassurance, the minimization of risk that was Andrew's to take. "You're removing my name," George said firmly. "Today." Andrew laughed once humorless. "You're serious?" "Yes." "This is insane," Andrew snapped. "You're going to derail my future over paperwork." "I'm protecting mine," George shot back. "And you're fixing this immediately." Andrew's patience finally cracked. "You don't trust me at all, do you?" George hesitated, the truth pressing hard against his chest. "Not the way I did yesterday." That answer only fueled Andrew's frustration. "Fine, I'll handle it. You don't need to threaten me like I'm some criminal." George's voice dropped. "I'm not threatening you. I'm warning you. If my name stays on that loan, I will take legal action." Andrew went quiet, then sighed dramatically. "You're being dramatic. I said I'll fix it." "When?" George asked. "Soon," Andrew replied. "Let me work it out." "That's not an answer." Andrew's tone turned dismissive. "Dad, relax, I've got this." The call ended shortly after, Andrew promising resolution without offering specifics. George lowered the phone slowly, staring at it like it had betrayed him too. The anger didn't fade once the call ended. It sharpened. He replayed Andrew's words, just your name, small favor for the family, each one cutting deeper than the last. This wasn't recklessness, it was entitlement. By midday, George knew waiting was no longer an option. Trust, once cracked, had a way of collapsing completely if ignored. He opened his contacts and scrolled to a name he hadn't hoped to need for something like this. Alicia. She answered on the second ring. George, you don't usually call without scheduling. I need advice, George said, immediately. An hour later, he sat across from her in her office, the loan documents spread neatly across her desk. Alicia reviewed them with practiced precision, her expression tightening as she reached the guarantor section. He used your name without authorization, she said flatly. Yes, George replied, and he's pretending it's nothing. Alicia leaned back, folding her hands. It's not nothing. If this loan defaults, they come after you first. Assets, credit, everything. George felt a chill settle in his stomach. Hearing it confirmed stripped away any lingering doubt. What do I do? He asked. You act fast, Alicia said. The longer your name is attached, the more exposure you have. We notify the lender, document lack of consent, and put legal pressure on your son to correct this immediately. George stared at the papers, seeing them now for what they really were, not a business form, but a line crossed. And if he resists, George asked. Alicia met his eyes, unwavering. Then this stops being a family issue and becomes a legal one. George nodded slowly, determination hardening where hesitation used to be. Whatever Andrew thought this was, it had already gone further than words could fix. And as George left the office, one truth followed him out the door. By the time Andrew realized how serious this had become, it would already be too late to undo the damage. The law firm's lobby smelled faintly of polished wood and old paper, the kind of place designed to project permanence. George had always respected that feeling, stability, control. Yet as he sat across from Alicia in her glass-walled office, those concepts felt thinner than they ever had before. Alicia closed the folder containing the loan documents and rested her hands on top of it. You did the right thing coming in when you did, she said calmly. But we need to move deliberately. George nodded, though his thoughts were elsewhere. He kept seeing Andrew's face from the night before, impatient, dismissive, convinced he was entitled to trust he hadn't earned. I've handled hostile takeovers with less resistance than a conversation with my own son, George said quietly. Alicia watched him closely. This isn't about business acumen, she replied. It's about boundaries, and right now yours were crossed. She outlined the options with precision. Notices to the lender, formal documentation stating lack of consent, a legal record that made it unmistakably clear Andrew had no authority to use George's name. If you don't push back hard, she said, you teach him that this kind of behavior is negotiable. George leaned back, exhaling slowly. I never thought I'd be sitting here discussing legal pressure against my own child. I know, Alicia said, but the message matters. This isn't punishment, it's accountability. The word lingered between them. George looked down at his hands. They were steady, but he felt exposed in a way no deal had ever made him feel. He didn't just risk my finances, he said. He assumed my consent, like I owed it to him. Alicia's expression softened slightly. That's the real injury. George swallowed, the anger giving way to something heavier. I've spent his entire life trying to set an example. Work hard, earn what you have, ask before you take. His voice faltered for just a moment, and he still did this behind my back. The silence that followed was thick but not uncomfortable. Alicia finally spoke. Your assets are safe for now. Nothing has been executed beyond preliminary documentation, but protection requires follow-through. She slid a sheet of paper toward him. Once we file this, it becomes formal. There's no pretending this is just a family misunderstanding. George stared at the paper. Signing it meant accepting something he'd been resisting since the moment he saw his name on that loan. That Andrew had made a deliberate choice, and choices had consequences. "What happens to him?" George asked. Alicia met his gaze. "He'll be forced to confront reality. Whether that leads to growth or resentment, that's out of our control." George closed his eyes briefly, then nodded. "Do it." The paperwork moved quickly after that. Signatures, copies, steps laid out in calm, methodical language that contrasted sharply with the turmoil inside him. By the time George stood to leave, he felt drained, but resolute. "You're doing this to protect yourself," Alicia reminded him as they walked toward the door. "Not to hurt him." "I know," George said, "but he's not going to see it that way." The drive home passed in a blur. Every red light felt longer than it should have been. George replayed years of conversations, wondering where caution had turned into entitlement, where guidance had been mistaken for permission. That night he barely slept. The next morning, George was pouring coffee when his phone rang. Alicia's name lit up the screen. "George," she said without preamble, "Andrew is here." George straightened. "Here." "In the building," Alicia clarified. "He asked to speak with me. He's in the lobby." For a moment George said nothing. His pulse slowed, his thoughts sharpening into focus. Andrew hadn't told him, hadn't warned him. He'd gone straight to the source, confident he could manage the situation on his own. "What did you tell him?" George asked. "That I'd speak with him," Alicia replied, "and that you're aware." George looked around his kitchen, suddenly aware of how calm everything looked. Sunlight through the window, steam rising from his mug, the ordinary world continuing, unaware that something fundamental was about to shift. "I'll be there," George said. As he grabbed his jacket, he caught his reflection in the hallway mirror. The man staring back wasn't just a father anymore. He was a man preparing to defend his name, his work, and the line his son had crossed. Whatever happened in that lobby, George knew one thing with certainty. The relationship he and Andrew had yesterday was already gone. Andrew arrived 10 minutes early, which he took as proof that he was still in control of the situation. The lobby of Alicia's firm was quiet, almost austere, marble floors, muted lighting, the soft murmur of distant phones. He stood near the reception desk, jacket buttoned, posture relaxed, projecting confidence he didn't entirely feel. To anyone watching, he looked like a man handling business, not someone who had crossed a line he didn't yet understand. Alicia emerged from the elevator with a folder tucked under her arm. She didn't smile. "Andrew," she said evenly, "let's talk." They sat in a small seating area just off the main lobby. No closed doors. No privacy beyond professional courtesy. That alone unsettled Andrew, though he masked it well. Alicia opened the folder. "I'll be direct," she began. "You listed your father as a guarantor on a commercial loan without his consent." Andrew leaned back slightly. "I already explained to him. It was preliminary." "That distinction doesn't matter," Alicia replied. "From a legal standpoint, intent and representation are enough to create exposure." Andrew frowned. "Exposure, come on, his name is on everything, this is nothing new." Alicia's eyes sharpened. "His name is on things he agreed to, this was not one of them." Andrew waved a hand, irritation creeping in. "You're making it sound criminal, it's family. I didn't think it was a big deal." The phrase hung in the air. "It is a big deal," Alicia said calmly. "Using someone's financial identity without authorization is a breach of trust, and if the lender had acted on this, your father would have been legally bound." Andrew straightened. "But they didn't, so what's the problem?" "The problem," Alicia said, closing the folder partway, "is that you decided for him, and decisions like that have consequences." Andrew's jaw tightened. "My father has always supported me." "Support is not consent," Alicia replied, "and support has limits." Andrew opened his mouth to respond. then stopped as movement near the entrance caught his eye. George had just walked in. He didn't approach immediately. He stood near the glass doors, hands in his coat pockets, watching. From a distance, Andrew could feel his presence like pressure on his chest. There was no anger on George's face. That somehow was worse. Andrew shifted in his seat. "Dad," he said, forcing a casual tone, "you didn't have to come down here." George said nothing. He took a few steps closer but remained silent, allowing the moment to stretch. Alicia continued, unfazed. "Your father has taken steps to protect himself," she said. "Those steps include notifying the lender and documenting his lack of authorization." Andrew's confidence cracked. "You already did that." "Yes," Alicia replied, "because time matters in situations like this." Andrew stood abruptly. "This is insane. You're acting like I stole from him." "You attempted to leverage him," Alicia corrected, "without permission." Andrew turned toward George, frustration spilling over. "Say something. You know I wasn't trying to hurt you." George finally spoke, his voice steady but firm. "Intent doesn't erase impact." Andrew took a step closer. "I was trying to build something for all of us." "For you," George said quietly, "at my expense." Andrew shook his head. "You're choosing lawyers over your own son." Alicia stood as well, her tone unchanging. "He's choosing accountability." Andrew laughed, sharp and humorless. "You're really going through with this?" George met his eyes now fully. "You forced my hand." The agitation Andrew had been suppressing surfaced all at once. "I said I'd fix it. You didn't even give me the chance." "I gave you a chance when I asked for honesty," George replied. "You gave me excuses." Andrew turned back to Alicia, voice rising. "You can't seriously think this is the right way to handle family." Alicia didn't flinch. "This stopped being a family matter when you crossed a legal boundary." Andrew opened his mouth again, but Alicia cut him off smoothly. "The lender will require immediate correction. Your father's name is to be removed. Any further attempt to involve him financially without written consent will result in formal action." The words landed with finality. Andrew looked back at George, searching for something: hesitation, doubt, mercy. He found none. George stepped forward then, closing the remaining distance between them. His presence alone quieted the space. "This is the lesson," George said evenly. "You don't take shortcuts with other people's lives, especially not mine." Andrew swallowed, anger mixing with disbelief. "So that's it." "For today," George replied. The silence that followed was heavy, unresolved. Andrew stood there, realizing too late that whatever leverage he thought he had was gone, and that this confrontation was only the beginning of something he could no longer control. Andrew left Alicia's office feeling small, the weight of the conversation pressing on his chest. His usual bravado had all but disappeared. His steps were heavy as he walked toward the elevator, shoulders hunched. He walked into that meeting thinking he could fix it, that he could talk his way out of the mess he'd created. But nothing had gone the way he expected. His father had stood firm, unshaken, his eyes filled with something that felt colder than anger, something closer to finality. The door to the elevator closed behind him, and Andrew stood there, staring at his reflection in the polished metal, barely recognizing the person looking back. He had underestimated the situation. Worse, he'd underestimated his father. The realization settled in, the bitter truth that everything had just changed. There was no going back now. What had been a father-son disagreement had escalated into something much more significant. Trust, once broken, wasn't so easily repaired. George, for his part, was sitting at home, alone in the quiet of his study. The paperwork was stacked neatly on his desk, the legal steps taken to protect his finances in place. But no matter how much he tried to focus on the pragmatic side of things, he couldn't shake the weight in his chest. He had won the legal battle. He'd secured his assets, set clear boundaries. But the emotional cost of what had just happened was far more difficult to measure. His relationship with Andrew, the bond he'd worked so hard to build, was now in jeopardy. There was no law firm that could fix that. No lawyer could fill the space that had once been filled with trust, with respect. He'd always known his son had his flaws, but this breach felt like a line that couldn't be uncrossed. A soft chime from his phone broke his thoughts. It was a text from Andrew. "Dad, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Please, can we talk?" George stared at the message, a familiar frustration rising in him. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he read the words again, trying to gauge sincerity. But the apology felt hollow. It was too quick, too convenient, too far removed from the reality of what had just happened. It wasn't the apology of someone who understood the weight of their actions. It was an apology born out of desperation, and that made it feel even more empty. He set the phone down with a sigh. This wasn't a conversation he was ready to have, not yet. He needed space, time to process what had happened, to understand how he felt. Because the truth was, he didn't just feel angry or betrayed. He felt grief. Grief for the son he thought he knew, grief for the relationship that had once been so strong and now felt irreparably fractured. Later that evening, the phone rang again. This time, it was Andrew's voice on the other end. "Dad, I'm really sorry. I didn't think it would escalate like this," Andrew said, his voice tight, the words spilling out with a sense of urgency. "I should have asked you first. I should have been more open. I don't know what I was thinking." George sat in silence for a long moment. The apology, while better than the text, still didn't hit the mark. The words didn't have the weight of understanding behind them. Andrew sounded more like someone trying to fix the situation than someone who had truly come to grips with the damage he had caused. "I don't know if you do," George finally replied, his voice steady but cold. "It's not just about asking, Andrew. It's about respect. It's about trust. And that's something you can't just fix with an apology." Andrew fell silent on the other end. For a brief moment, George almost wished he could hear the anger, the frustration, the pleading. Something that would tell him his son was still capable of feeling the weight of what he'd done. But all George heard was the quiet, uncomfortable pause and the faint sound of Andrew exhaling. "Dad, please," Andrew said, the desperation creeping back into his tone. "I'll fix this. I will. Just let's talk in person, please." George felt a flicker of something, maybe hope, maybe doubt, pass through him. He wanted to believe that his son could learn from this, that there was still a path forward for them. But the truth was, he wasn't sure anymore. Trust wasn't something you could rebuild with a few words, and Andrew had done more than just break his trust. He had taken something from George that could never be replaced. "I'll think about it," George said, the finality in his voice unmistakable. "But understand this, trust doesn't come back overnight. You've broken it, Andrew, and now you have to live with that." He hung up before Andrew could respond, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over him. This wasn't just about the loan. This was about the choices Andrew had made, the way he'd taken for granted that his father would always back him up, no matter what. And George was done being that safety net. A few days later, Lisa called. "I know this isn't easy," she said, her voice soft, the uncertainty in it clear. "But can we talk? Can we meet? I think it's time for a family conversation." George paused before answering. He could hear the pleading in her voice, the hope that things could be fixed, that there was still a way to bring the family back together. And he wanted to believe it too, but deep down he knew it wouldn't be the same, not after everything that had happened. "I'll come," George said, his voice quiet but resolute. "But understand this, things can't go back to the way they were, not after this." As he prepared for the meeting, George couldn't shake the feeling that the distance between him and Andrew had already become too great to bridge. The trust that had taken years to build felt like a bridge on the verge of collapsing, and no matter how hard they tried, he wasn't sure there was enough left to repair it. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the creaking of the wooden chairs as everyone took their seats. The air was thick with tension. The once familiar warmth of George's home had shifted into something colder, more distant, like the walls themselves were bearing witness to a rift that couldn't be undone. Andrew sat at the far end of the table, his hands clasped tightly together in front of him, his eyes scanning the room like he was searching for something to steady himself. His posture was rigid, defensive, but also weary. He had come to the meeting prepared to fix things, or at least to try. He had apologized 100 times in his mind, rehearsing the words until they felt hollow. But now, in front of his father, it felt different. Nothing seemed to reach the place inside him, where the damage had truly settled. George sat opposite him, his expression unreadable. There was no anger on his face, no outburst of frustration, just calm. Cold, controlled calm. It was the kind of calm that made Andrew's insides twist. He knew his father too well. This wasn't forgiveness waiting to happen, it was the silence before something final. Andrew took a breath and began, his voice a little tighter than he intended. "Dad, I'm really sorry for what happened. I didn't mean for any of this to go the way it did. I thought I was doing the right thing, trying to secure my future. I was desperate." George's eyes flickered, but he didn't interrupt. He didn't give anything away. "I acted out of desperation, and that was wrong. I know that now," Andrew continued, his voice edging toward the pleading. "But I didn't think it would escalate like this. I didn't think you'd react the way you did." George didn't move, his gaze steady and unyielding. "Desperation is not an excuse," he said quietly. His words felt like they had weight, carrying years of experience, years of effort, years of trust built and shattered in one decision. "You crossed a line, Andrew. A line that no amount of desperation can justify." Andrew's chest tightened. He had expected his father's disappointment, but hearing it so directly, without any attempt to sugarcoat it, hit harder than he imagined. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words felt like they were stuck, tangled in the space between apology and justification. "I didn't ask you first, I didn't come to you for help," Andrew finally said, the rawness of his admission surprising even him. "I just assumed you'd be there, and that was wrong. I didn't respect you or your place in this family." Lisa, sitting next to George, shifted uncomfortably in her seat. She had been quiet through most of the exchange, but she couldn't stand the growing divide anymore. She had always been the peacekeeper, the one trying to smooth over the tension. This time, though, it felt different. Nothing she said would make this right, but still she tried. "Andrew," she said softly, turning to her husband first, then to her father-in-law, "can't we just talk about this? He's acknowledging what he did. Isn't that enough? We can figure this out as a family." Her voice was gentle, but it didn't land the way she hoped. George turned his gaze toward her, his expression softening for the first time in the meeting. But it wasn't enough to bridge the gap. "No, Lisa," George said, his voice firm but not unkind. "This isn't something we can just talk our way through. Trust, once broken, can't be patched back together with words alone." Andrew swallowed hard, looking between the two of them. The reality of the situation began to settle in. He had expected, maybe even hoped, for an easier way out, some sort of reconciliation that could restore everything to the way it was. But the cold, implacable look in his father's eyes told him everything. There was no easy fix. "I messed up," Andrew said, his voice thick. "I know that, and I'm sorry. I never realized how far it had gone, how much I'd lost by making that choice." George sat back, his eyes never leaving his son's face. "You've lost more than you know, but you've also shown me that trust isn't something I can hand out freely anymore. You've made your choices, and now you have to live with the consequences of them." The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Lisa's attempts to mediate had only drawn more attention to the widening gap between father and son. Neither of them spoke for several moments, the weight of what had been said hanging in the air like a dark cloud. Finally, Andrew spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I understand. I understand that I've messed things up, and I'll do whatever it takes to fix it, but I know it's not going to be easy. I just hope one day you'll see that I've learned from this." George's eyes softened for a brief second, but the resolve in his voice never wavered. "That day might come, but it's not today." Andrew nodded slowly, his head hanging low. He knew now that whatever had existed between him and his father before, whatever trust they had shared, was gone. And as he left that room, he knew it was a loss he couldn't undo. The family meeting ended not with resolution, but with a new, unspoken truth. Things had changed forever. And for Andrew, the hardest part was knowing that he had to face the consequences of his actions, alone. The days following the family meeting felt like an endless stretch of quiet, each hour passing slower than the last. George went about his routine, as he always did, early mornings in his office, late evenings reviewing accounts, meetings with partners that demanded his full attention. He had mastered the art of keeping busy, and now, more than ever, he needed it. The silence between him and Andrew wasn't just an absence of words. It was the weight of unspoken truths, of a breach that couldn't be undone with a simple apology. He focused on the things that mattered most: his work, the steady pace of daily life, the projects he'd put on hold for far too long. But even as he threw himself into these tasks, the undercurrent of what had happened simmered beneath it all. Andrew's face, his tone, those moments in the family meeting kept playing in his mind. The anger had faded, but something else lingered. The grief of losing trust in his son, of seeing the relationship they once had crumble so completely, was a deeper wound than George had anticipated. Meanwhile, Andrew was caught in his own storm. Every quiet moment, every task he tried to complete was overshadowed by the guilt he carried. The words from his father, "Trust doesn't come back overnight," echoed in his head, a constant reminder of the gulf that now separated them. He had tried to fix it. He had tried to reach out, but each attempt felt more desperate than the last. His phone sat untouched, as if waiting for the right moment that never seemed to come. It wasn't until Lisa brought up the subject again that the silence was broken. One evening, after dinner, she turned to George with a mixture of concern and frustration in her eyes. "You can't just leave things like this," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Andrew's struggling. You saw it in his face. He's trying, but it's like you've both put up walls that are too high." George didn't look up from his paperwork. He could feel the weight of her words, but he wasn't ready to acknowledge them. "I'm not sure what there is to fix," he replied quietly. He crossed a line, and I'm not in the business of forgiving something like that so easily. Lisa exhaled sharply, the frustration she'd been holding back breaking through. "He's your son, George. He made a mistake, yes, but you can't just erase everything because of that. Don't you think it's worth trying?" George leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping against the desk. "It's not that simple." She paused, then nodded, her eyes softening. "I know, but just think about it. Maybe you need time, but don't close the door completely." George said nothing, his mind too occupied with the weight of the situation. In the days that followed, Andrew began to seek help. He started therapy, trying to understand why he'd acted the way he did, why he'd been so blinded by his own ambitions. Each session felt like peeling back layers of his own insecurities, facing the consequences of his actions one painful realization at a time. He didn't expect it to be easy, but as he confronted the truth, he realized just how much he had taken for granted. George, too, began to soften, if only slightly. The relentless anger had faded, replaced by a quiet, nagging understanding that healing took time. He wasn't ready to forgive, not yet, but the idea that one day, perhaps years from now, things might be different lingered in his mind. But the road to reconciliation was uncertain, and neither of them knew if they'd ever find their way back to what they had. As the days passed, the distance between them remained. Days turned into weeks, and the silence between John and Andrew only grew thicker, stretching like an unspoken wall between them. Neither of them made the first move. The house, usually filled with conversations, the occasional laughter, and the hum of daily life, now felt eerily quiet. The kind of quiet that made every moment feel heavy, weighted down by all that had been left unsaid. Andrew spent many of those nights staring at the ceiling, the darkness offering no escape from his own thoughts. He had hoped time would dull the ache in his chest, that maybe, in the quiet solitude of his mistakes, he would find clarity. But all he found was guilt, and that guilt gnawed at him. Every time he saw his father's name on his phone, every time he passed by his office, every time he tried to focus on anything else. The betrayal he had caused felt like an invisible weight on his shoulders, and no matter how many times he replayed the events in his mind, there was no easy way to undo it. He tried at first to fix it by calling, by texting, but each attempt felt like he was pushing against a door that had already been locked, and no matter how hard he pushed, it wouldn't open. It wasn't just that John wasn't responding, it was the way he didn't respond. The silence from his father spoke volumes. John, for his part, had buried himself in work. His career, his responsibilities, and the daily grind became the only distractions that kept him from dwelling on the mess his son had made of their relationship. He told himself he didn't need to think about it, not yet. There were meetings to attend, deals to close, and projects that required all his attention. The urgency of business became a comfortable cloak, one that shielded him from the rawness of the situation at home. But even behind the safety of his work, doubts began to creep in. Should he be the one to reach out? Should he make the first move and try to repair what was broken, or should he let Andrew come to him? He'd spent years teaching his son about responsibility, about facing consequences for actions. So why should he be the one to soften first? That sense of pride, the pride that had once kept him grounded, now kept him distant. Every time he thought about taking the first step, a wave of hesitation held him back. He wasn't sure if forgiveness was something that could come so easily. What Andrew had done wasn't just a small mistake. It had shattered the trust they'd built, the kind of trust that took a lifetime to create and only moments to destroy. Lisa, always the peacemaker, couldn't stand seeing the rift grow any longer. She had watched her husband and son struggle in silence, their distance growing with every passing day. Desperation had started to set in for her. She couldn't fix it, but maybe, just maybe, she could nudge them towards something resembling reconciliation. One evening she sat down with John, her voice soft but firm. "We can't just let this go on. Andrew's not going to give up, you know that, right? He's not going to let this be the end." John didn't look up from his papers. He needs to learn what real consequences feel like. He's got to understand that actions have weight, Lisa. "I know," she replied, her tone full of quiet resolve. "But it's not just about consequences, it's about healing. Don't you think it's time to at least talk about it, for all our sakes?" John paused, the weight of her words settling on him. The part of him that wanted to stay resolute, to hold his ground, began to waver, but it wasn't enough to push him forward. Not yet. Andrew, on the other hand, had made up his mind. He couldn't keep waiting for a sign that would never come. The silence was killing him, and the growing distance from his father felt like a chasm that was impossible to cross. He needed to fix it. He needed to make it right, whether his father was ready or not. One evening, after weeks of hesitation, he called John. "I think we need to talk," Andrew said, his voice tight but steady. "I know I've messed up, I know I've hurt you, but I can't live with this hanging between us. I need a chance to make things right." John's voice was calm, but there was a steel edge to it. "You want to meet?" "I do," Andrew replied, his throat tight, "but only if you're willing to hear me out." There was a long pause on the other end. John was still processing, weighing his options, trying to figure out what this would mean. He finally spoke, his voice tinged with reluctance. "I'll think about it, but don't expect me to make this easy for you." And with that, the silence fell again. The same silence that had hung over them for weeks, stretching on with no resolution in sight. Andrew hung up the phone, his heart pounding, knowing that reaching out hadn't brought him any closer to what he wanted. He wasn't sure if this meeting would be the beginning of rebuilding or the final chapter in a broken relationship. But one thing was clear: the divide between father and son was far from over, and the question remained, could they ever bridge it, or had it already become too wide to cross? The therapy office was small, almost uncomfortably so. The walls, a muted shade of blue, seemed to absorb the sounds of Andrew's thoughts. He sat on the leather chair, his hands clasped in front of him, eyes focused on the floor. Every part of him wanted to bolt out of the room to escape the confrontation he was forcing himself to have with his own emotions. But he couldn't. Not anymore. It had taken weeks to get here, to sit across from someone who wasn't family, wasn't a friend, someone who could help him untangle the mess he had created, both inside himself and with his father. "I don't even know where to start," Andrew said, his voice rough, as if the words themselves were heavy with the burden of everything he'd been avoiding. "I'm just so angry, I guess, at everything, at my father, at myself. I never really understood why things got this bad." The therapist, a woman in her mid-40s with a calm demeanor, nodded gently, her eyes encouraging but not pressing. "Tell me more about the anger, Andrew. What are you really angry about?" Andrew shifted in his seat, feeling the weight of her question. What was he angry about? It seemed like an obvious answer. He was angry at his father for pulling away, for not trusting him, for making him feel small. But as he started to speak the words, something else rose within him, something he hadn't fully acknowledged until now. I think I'm angry because I feel like I'm not good enough," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've spent my whole life trying to prove that I can do it on my own, that I'm not just living in my dad's shadow. And I thought," he stopped himself, the realization settling in, "I thought if I could prove to him that I could handle a big deal, that I could take on something like this, then maybe he'd finally see me as something more than just his son. Maybe I thought it would make me feel good enough too." The therapist let the silence linger, allowing him to sit with the weight of his own words. For the first time in a long time, Andrew was seeing himself clearly, not just as the who'd acted out of desperation, but as someone who had spent his entire life chasing validation. And in the process, he had completely ignored the values his father had taught him. "I did it to prove something," Andrew admitted, the sting of self-realization sharp. "I didn't think about how it would affect anyone else. Not my dad, not my wife, just me." The therapist nodded again. "And how does that make you feel?" "Regret," Andrew answered immediately. "And guilt, so much guilt." As the days passed, Andrew's thoughts continued to spiral, but now they had a focus. He wasn't just reflecting on the loan or the decision that had driven a wedge between him and his father. He was reflecting on everything: the ways he had always tried to measure up, the ways he'd acted out of his own insecurities. And somewhere deep down, he knew this was bigger than the loan. This was about proving his worth, about feeling like he could stand on his own. One evening, after another long day of reflection, Andrew made a decision. He had to talk to his father, not just about the loan, but about everything. All the times he had acted selfishly, all the times he had failed to consider how his actions affected those around him. He needed to own up to it all. He called his father the next morning. "Dad, I need to talk to you." Andrew's voice was shaky but firm. "I want to apologize, not just for what happened with the loan, but for everything. For the times I didn't listen, for the times I took your support for granted. I've been selfish, and I know I've hurt you." There was a long pause on the other end. John's voice, when it came, was careful but steady. "I'll meet you, but I'm not sure what this is going to look like." Andrew's heart pounded. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't about finding a quick resolution, but it was a start, a real start. The day of the meeting, the tension between them was palpable. When Andrew arrived at John's house, his father was already waiting in the living room. The air was thick with things unspoken. John motioned for him to sit, his expression unreadable. The conversation began awkwardly, both of them aware of the weight of the moment. Andrew cleared his throat. Dad, I've been thinking about everything, and I can't just apologize for the loan. I have to apologize for all the ways I've let you down, for not respecting you, for thinking I could do it all on my own. John remained quiet for a long moment, his eyes fixed on his son. The anger was still there, but so was something else, a recognition of Andrew's vulnerability. "It's a lot to take in, son," John said, his voice rough. "But I appreciate you saying it. I'm not ready to forgive you yet, but I'm listening." Andrew felt a wave of relief wash over him, though it was tempered with the realization that this conversation was just the beginning. The damage he had done couldn't be undone in a single meeting, but maybe, just maybe, they could start to rebuild. As John met his gaze, Andrew knew that the road to healing would be long and uncertain, but it was a road they would have to walk together, or not at all. The living room was quiet when Andrew entered, the space now feeling unfamiliar, almost colder than it had before. He paused at the threshold, looking across the room to where his father sat, waiting for him. John's posture was straight, rigid, controlled. The space between them felt heavier than it had during their last conversation. It wasn't just the silence, it was the weight of everything that had led up to this moment. Andrew took a slow breath and stepped further into the room, his nerves tight. He knew what this meeting meant, knew that it wasn't just another conversation, it was the beginning of something. Whether it was a new chapter or the slow erosion of what little remained of their relationship, he wasn't sure. He only knew one thing: if he was ever going to have a chance to rebuild any trust with his father, it started here. John didn't speak immediately. His eyes followed Andrew, unwavering. The hurt was still there, simmering beneath the surface, but there was something else, too, something that Andrew hadn't been able to see before. Maybe it was the exhaustion of bearing the weight of his own mistakes. Maybe it was the small flicker of hope that John might finally hear him out. Andrew stood there, unsure of where to start. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. I don't know where to begin, but I need to say this. I'm sorry, Dad. I know that everything I've done, all the mistakes, have hurt you. I can't take it back, but I want you to know I'm trying to be better. I'm trying to understand what went wrong, what I did wrong." John studied him for a long moment, the silence between them thick, as if the words Andrew had just spoken were heavy enough to carry the entire weight of their broken relationship. John's jaw tightened, but he didn't look away. "You've hurt more than just me, Andrew. This isn't just about a loan or a mistake," he said, his voice measured, yet heavy with the strain of everything that had been left unsaid. "This is about trust, and trust isn't something that comes back easily." Andrew nodded, his throat tight. I know that now, and I know that I can't just expect you to forgive me right away, but I want to show you, I want to prove to you that I'm not the person I was when I made that decision. I've been talking to someone, trying to understand why I did what I did. And I know I can't change the past, but I can try to build something better from here. John's expression softened just slightly. The anger, while still present, was now tempered with something that Andrew didn't expect: caution. "I'm not saying I'm ready to just forget everything, Andrew, but I see that you're trying, and that's something." Andrew's heart lifted, but the reality of the situation still hung heavily in the air. "I'll do whatever it takes. I don't want to be that person anymore. I can't keep pretending like I can just brush this off. I'll work harder to rebuild my integrity. I'll prove to you that I'm serious about changing." John exhaled slowly, rubbing his jaw as he processed his son's words. "You're right," he said, his voice steady but firm. "This won't happen overnight, but we can start small. I need to see consistent actions, Andrew. Actions that show me that you're really willing to change. No more shortcuts, no more lies." Andrew didn't hesitate. "I'll pay back everything I tried to borrow, every penny. I'll start with that, and I'll show you that I'm serious." There was a pause as John absorbed this. Andrew felt a flicker of something, maybe hope, maybe relief, rising within him. For the first time in weeks, he felt like they might be able to get somewhere. John finally nodded, but his gaze remained unwavering. "Good. But know this, Andrew, this is only the beginning. You've got a long road ahead of you, and if you slip again, if you show me that you're not willing to do the work, then we're done. No more chances." Andrew swallowed hard, the weight of his father's words sinking in. "I understand, and I won't let you down." John looked at him for a moment longer, as if weighing the sincerity of his son's words. Then finally he gave a small nod. "We'll see, but I'm willing to try too. We'll take it slow, one step at a time." For the first time in a long time, Andrew felt a spark of something. Maybe hope, maybe determination. The road ahead was uncertain, and the damage couldn't be undone quickly. But this moment, this first step, felt like a fragile bridge between them, one that had the potential to rebuild the trust they had lost. As Andrew left the room, he felt a strange sense of both relief and dread. There was still so much work to be done, and the true test had only just begun. The first few weeks after their conversation felt like an uphill climb for Andrew. The weight of his debts, both financial and emotional, pressed down on him every day. He had promised his father that he would take responsibility, but now, facing the mountain of bills, the growing list of obligations, he realized just how much work it would take to climb out of the hole he had dug for himself. Andrew wasn't used to this kind of struggle. His life had been comfortable, no real financial strain, no urgent need to prove himself to anyone outside his own ambitions. But now, it was different. Each morning, he woke up with a sense of purpose, but also a gnawing dread of the hard work ahead. He started with the basics, cutting down unnecessary expenses, negotiating payment plans with creditors, and starting a budget he hadn't bothered to think about in years. John had made it clear that this was his battle to fight, but that didn't mean he was leaving Andrew to flounder. He had offered some support, nothing more than guidance. "I'll help you figure out the steps, but it's on you to follow through," John had said, his voice firm but not unkind. He wasn't going to fix Andrew's mistakes for him, but he was showing him how to fix them. And for the first time, Andrew appreciated that. John didn't offer financial help. He knew this was the only way Andrew would learn. Instead, he showed him the ropes of handling responsibility, things Andrew had never really paid attention to before. The way John broke down each step with a quiet authority made it clear that this was something he had mastered long ago, and now it was Andrew's turn. One of the first steps was attending financial counseling. The sessions were grueling. Andrew didn't expect to feel so exposed, so raw. The counselor, a no-nonsense woman named Sarah, didn't mince words. "You've been living beyond your means for too long," she told him during their first session. "This is about more than numbers. This is about changing your mindset." For the first time, Andrew was forced to confront his own behavior, his compulsion to prove himself, to take risks, to act impulsively in ways that had now spiraled out of control. He had thought that taking shortcuts would bring him the success he wanted, but all it had brought him was disaster. Lisa, who had been quietly observing from the sidelines, began to see changes in Andrew. She watched him pore over financial books late into the night, attending meetings, setting goals, and starting to rebuild the credit he had nearly ruined. It wasn't easy, and there were days when he felt like he wasn't making any progress, but she could see it in his eyes. He was committed. She believed in him now in a way she hadn't before. Maybe, just maybe, he could turn things around. John had been watching too, but with more caution. He saw the effort Andrew was putting in, but old habits die hard. He wasn't sure if this was just a phase, some temporary burst of motivation that would fade when the pressure eased. So he kept his distance, allowing Andrew to prove himself, but never fully trusting that this was the new Andrew, the one who wouldn't make the same mistakes again. Yet as the weeks passed, the small changes started to add up. Andrew was sticking to the budget. He was making calls to his creditors, facing the mess he had made head-on. Even more surprisingly, he and John had started communicating more openly. The tension that once defined their relationship had lessened, replaced by a tentative respect. They spoke more about the steps Andrew was taking, his struggles, his small victories. John was still guarded, but he had softened just a little. The shift wasn't dramatic, but it was real. Andrew could see it in his father's eyes when he spoke about the progress he'd made. It wasn't the full trust that he longed for, but it was something. And for Andrew, that was enough for now. Still, as the days went on, Andrew knew there was a long road ahead. Trust wasn't something that could be fixed with good intentions or hard work alone. It would take time, a lot of it. But with each passing day, as he took responsibility and made better choices, he began to feel the weight of the past lifting bit by bit. And though it was still fragile, the small glimmer of hope that had been buried beneath the hurt was starting to shine through, not just for Andrew, but for the future of his relationship with his father. Andrew stared at the email, his finger hovering over the mouse. The offer was tempting, more than tempting. It promised a chance to finally get ahead, to prove to everyone, especially to his father, that he could handle something big. The numbers were staggering, the potential payoff immense. Everything Andrew had ever wanted seemed within reach. But a nagging voice in the back of his mind stopped him from clicking accept. It had been months since the conversation with his father, months since he had started rebuilding the trust that had been broken, and yet here he was, staring down a decision that threatened to undo all the progress he'd made. The temptation was almost overwhelming. He could already hear the validation in his head, the praise from his peers, the acknowledgement that he was more than just the son of a successful businessman. But then, like a flash, he remembered the fall he'd taken last time, how quickly everything had unraveled. He had learned the hard way that shortcuts were dangerous, that impulse and desperation led to disastrous consequences. The phone buzzed on his desk, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from his father. "I heard about the investment opportunity. If you want to talk it through, I'm here." Andrew stared at the words. He wasn't sure what he expected, but it wasn't this. His father wasn't offering a lecture, wasn't jumping in with advice or warnings. He was simply acknowledging the situation. It was a subtle reminder that John was still watching, still hoping for Andrew to make the right choice on his own. Andrew sat back in his chair, the weight of the decision settling in. He had made mistakes before, rushed into decisions without fully thinking them through, and now here was the ultimate test. His father's advice, his father's support was within reach, but the decision was still his. Could he stand on his own, or would he fall back into the same patterns? He picked up the phone and dialed his father. "Hey, Dad." Andrew's voice was steady but uncertain. "Andrew," John replied, his voice calm. "I take it you're considering the offer." "I don't know," Andrew admitted. "It feels right, but I know what happened last time. I'm scared of making the same mistake." There was a pause on the other end, a long, quiet stretch before John spoke. "You're scared because you're thinking about it. That's good. You're not rushing into anything. That's how you know you've learned something. The problem is, you can't go through life second-guessing every move either. You have to trust yourself, but you also have to know when to say no." Andrew felt a lump form in his throat. "I don't want to mess this up again. I'm no. The same person I was, but I'm still afraid. I don't know if I can handle something like this without falling back into old habits." John's voice softened. "There's no shame in saying no, son. Not every opportunity is the right one, no matter how tempting it looks." Andrew ran a hand through his hair, looking down at the offer again. The weight of his father's words echoed in his mind, but still, he hesitated. It was a big decision, a defining one, but he could feel, deep down, that it wasn't the right move. Not yet. "I'm going to pass on it," Andrew said, the words surprisingly clear as they left his mouth. "It's not the right time. I'm not ready to jump in like that again." John's silence lingered for a moment before he spoke, his voice more reassuring now. "I'm proud of you, Andrew. It's not an easy decision, but it's the right one. You've taken a step forward." Andrew felt the tension in his chest loosen slightly, though the uncertainty still lingered. Saying no didn't feel like victory, but it didn't feel like defeat either. It felt like growth, a small step, but a step nonetheless. Later that evening, Lisa found him at the kitchen table. his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. She knew the weight of the decision he had just made, the battle he'd fought within himself. "You did the right thing," she said, her voice soft but filled with conviction. Andrew nodded, but the relief he expected didn't quite come. "I hope so," he replied. "It wasn't easy." Lisa sat down beside him, her eyes filled with pride. "I can see the change in you. You're not the same person who made those decisions before. I know it's not going to be perfect, but you're getting there." John, too, noticed the change. Though proud of his son's decision, he understood that this moment wasn't the end of the journey. It was simply a point along the way. The road to healing, to rebuilding trust, was long. There would be setbacks, more tests. But for now, this moment was a turning point. Both father and son had faced a difficult choice, and for the first time they had made it together, even if from a distance. And though Andrew had made the right decision, there was still much more to prove. The real test, he knew, was yet to come. The morning was quiet, almost unnervingly so. The sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting soft lines across the living room floor. John sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in hand, his thoughts lost in the quiet rhythm of the day. It had been months since the fallout with Andrew, months since everything had started to shift. There had been progress, small steps, but the air between them was still thick with what had been lost. John's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the front door creaking open. He looked up, expecting to see Lisa, but instead, Andrew walked in. His son, who had once been so quick to rush in with excuses or deflections, now moved slower, his footsteps hesitant as if he wasn't sure whether he had a right to be here. The weight of the past still hung over him, but there was something different in his eyes now, a vulnerability John hadn't seen before. Andrew paused at the threshold, his hands in his pockets, his posture rigid yet unsure. He looked older, worn in a way that seemed to speak of the struggle he'd been through. And for the first time, John saw his son not as the boy who had betrayed him, but as someone who had truly been working to rebuild himself. "I need to talk to you," Andrew said, his voice quiet, almost fragile. John didn't reply immediately. He just studied Andrew, waiting for something, anything, that might indicate what this moment was going to be. The anger that had once consumed him had faded over time, replaced with a weariness he couldn't shake. He had seen Andrew try, seen him fight through the consequences of his actions, but this was different. This was the moment that would define whether the cracks between them could ever truly heal. Andrew stepped forward, his eyes locked on the floor as if afraid to meet his father's gaze. I want to apologize," he began, the words slow but steady. "For what I did, for how I betrayed you. I know I can't undo it, and I know that I've hurt you in ways that I didn't fully understand until now." John felt the familiar pang of grief, but this time it was mixed with something else, something that made the words Andrew spoke feel genuine. "I've been working so hard to change," Andrew continued, his voice cracking slightly. "I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I know it'll take time, but I need you to know that I'm not the same person who made that decision. I'm sorry, Dad." There was a long pause. John's heart was beating loudly in his chest, the weight of his son's apology settling into the space between them. His mind flashed back to the betrayal, to the anger, to the feeling of being blindsided by the person he had trusted most in the world. But as he looked at Andrew now, his son seemed different. Smaller, more humble, but not broken. This was the man who had made a mistake, and now he was acknowledging it, asking for something that felt almost impossible to grant. John took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the coffee cup. The hurt, the betrayal, it was all still there, buried deep. But there was something else, too. The realization that forgiveness wasn't about erasing the past. It wasn't about pretending it never happened or pretending things could go back to how they were. It was about accepting the growth that had occurred in the wake of that mistake. John met Andrew's eyes, his expression unreadable. "It's not easy," he said quietly, "to forgive someone for what you've lost." His voice cracked for a brief moment, but he continued, "But I see you. I see the work you've done, the effort, and that matters." The air between them seemed to lighten, just a fraction. Andrew's shoulders, which had been tense since he entered, seemed to relax. It wasn't the full reconciliation that either of them wanted, but it was a start. It was a shift, a moment of understanding. John stood then, the movement slow and deliberate. He didn't say anything else at first. He simply walked over to Andrew and pulled him into an embrace. It was brief, but in that moment it felt like everything had shifted. Like a door had opened between them, one they hadn't known how to approach for so long. Lisa, standing in the doorway, watched the scene unfold. She had been on the sidelines, watching them both struggle to rebuild what had been broken, but now she saw something she hadn't seen in months: hope. It wasn't complete, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. For the first time in a long time, John felt something stir within him that hadn't been there for a while: peace. The kind of peace that comes not from forgetting, but from accepting that the past, while painful, doesn't have to define everything. As the embrace ended, Andrew pulled back, his eyes red but clear. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice full of emotion. John gave a small nod. "We've got a long way to go, son, but we'll get there." And for the first time in months, Andrew believed it. But as they stood there, the journey was far from over, and both of them knew that the road ahead would still be difficult. Trust had been broken, and rebuilding it would take time. But in that moment, both father and son found something new between them: a fragile, tentative hope. The future was uncertain, but at least now they were moving forward together. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of John's office, casting a warm glow across the polished wood of the desk. For the first time in a long while, the room didn't feel so cold. John sat at his desk, reviewing papers, but his mind kept drifting. The silence between him and Andrew wasn't as heavy anymore. It was there, still lingering, but it was different. For the first time in months, there was hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, the distance between them had begun to close. Andrew walked into the room, his steps steady, more assured than they had been in the past. He was dressed in a suit, not just for appearance's sake, but because he had taken on a new responsibility in the family business. John had asked him to handle a new project, one that would stretch Andrew's capabilities and prove that he could be trusted with more than just the minor tasks. Andrew set the stack of files down on the desk, his eyes briefly meeting his father's before he spoke. "I've gone over the proposal," he said, his voice steady but full of the weight of the responsibility now placed on his shoulders. "I think we can move forward with the investment, but there are some risks we'll need to address before we make the final decision." John leaned back in his chair, taking in the sight of his son. He hadn't expected to feel this way, but there was something different about Andrew now. He was focused, determined, no longer the impulsive young man who had once acted without thinking. There was caution in his words, but there was also a quiet confidence. John nodded, pushing aside the part of him that still wanted to take control, that still wanted to protect his son from potential failure. This was Andrew's chance to prove he could handle responsibility, but it wasn't going to be easy. John knew that, and he wasn't about to let his son forget that trust had to be earned. "I'll leave the decision to you," John said, his tone measured. "But make sure you've covered every angle. This isn't just about money. It's about reputation, about the future of this business." Andrew nodded, his jaw tightening with resolve. "LVE, I understand." He paused, then added, "I won't let you down, Dad." As John watched Andrew walk out of the room to carry out the project, a strange sense of pride welled up inside him. He had seen his son struggle, seen him make mistakes that cost them both, but now he was watching Andrew take ownership, not just of the work but of his own growth. The boy he had known was starting to fade, replaced by a man who could stand on his own 2 feet. Over the next few weeks, Andrew's progress became undeniable. He handled the project with careful precision, showing an attention to detail that hadn't been there before. He sought advice when necessary, but never relied on his father's approval for every decision. It wasn't just the work he was doing that impressed John. It was the way he was doing it, with responsibility, humility, and a work ethic that spoke volumes. John remained cautious, still protective of the assets he had worked a lifetime to build. But he began to see his son not just as a mistake-prone young man, but as a capable, dependable adult. It was a slow shift, but it was real. As they worked side by side, the tension that once defined their relationship began to fade, replaced by a quiet understanding. The bond they had lost was starting to resurface, though it was clear that they were no longer the same people who had once shared the same kind of closeness. Lisa, too, could see the change. She watched her husband and son work together, and for the first time she felt that old spark of hope, that the family they had lost was slowly coming back together. But even as progress was made, John knew that the road ahead wasn't a straight line. Trust had been broken, and rebuilding it was still a work in progress. The journey was far from over, but with each small success, they were moving closer to something more solid. Something that, for the first time in a long while, felt like a new beginning. As Andrew left the office that evening, John watched him go, feeling the weight of his son's newfound independence. There was a long road ahead, but they had both taken the first steps down it. What lay ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, John felt that maybe, just maybe, they could walk that road together. It had been a long time since John felt the kind of peace that now quietly settled in the spaces between him and Andrew. The hard work, the struggles, the moments where neither of them knew if they could truly rebuild what had been broken, those were fading into something new, something neither of them had expected to find again. What had started as a tentative truce, built on small steps and guarded promises, had become a foundation of mutual respect and slowly trust. The tension that once defined their relationship was no longer there. It hadn't disappeared all at once, and it hadn't been easy, but over time, they had both come to understand what forgiveness really meant. For John, it wasn't about forgetting the past. It was about accepting the painful journey that had led them to this point. He could no longer see Andrew as the son who had betrayed him. Instead, he saw a man who had learned from his mistakes and was now working harder than anyone to prove he was worthy of the second chance. Andrew had changed, in ways he hadn't fully understood himself until now. His determination to prove he could stand on his own, to show his father he was more than the mistakes of his past, had turned into something deeper. It wasn't just about the business or about repairing their relationship. It was about Andrew coming to terms with who he was. He had spent so many years trying to live up to an image, to measure up to his father's expectations, that he had never fully understood the weight of his actions. But now, with each decision he made, Andrew wasn't just rebuilding trust with John. He was rebuilding trust in himself. Samantha, their daughter, had been watching from the sidelines, a quiet observer of the changes taking place. She had seen the tension between her father and brother before, the unspoken words, the awkward silences. But now, she noticed something different. When John and Andrew talked, it was no longer in short, curt exchanges. They spoke with the ease of people who had come to understand one another, who had learned the value of patience. "I'm proud of you both," Samantha said one evening as they sat in the living room. "It's good to see you guys like this again. Don't let this go. It's been a long time coming." John smiled at her, feeling the weight of her words. He had spent so much time focused on the things that had gone wrong, the times he had been hurt, that he had almost forgotten the possibility of this kind of reconciliation. It wasn't just about Andrew proving himself. It was about the two of them finding a way forward together. Slowly, John began to reflect on everything that had happened, the betrayals, the pain, the distance that had grown between them, and he realized despite the difficulty of the journey, it had been necessary. Both of them had grown, and that growth, as painful as it had been, was what had allowed them to find this moment. Lisa, watching the changes in her family, felt a quiet sense of gratitude fill her heart. She had feared this moment would never come, had feared that the rift between John and Andrew would define them forever. But now, as she watched them work together, sharing ideas and laughter, she felt a glimmer of hope that had eluded her for so long. The family, once so fractured, was coming back together. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. The true sign of their progress came when John and Andrew celebrated their first major milestone together in the family business. It was a moment of triumph, not just professionally, but personally. They had reached this point together, not as father and son in the old sense, but as equals, partners who had learned to respect and trust each other. That evening, the family gathered around the dinner table, the tension between them finally gone. As they shared their meal, there was an unspoken acknowledgement of how far they had come. They had survived the hardest part. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, the future felt brighter. The bonds between them were stronger than they had been in years. But even as the family shared a quiet moment of peace, a lingering thought remained. Could they continue to grow, or would the past someday creep back into their lives? The phone call came in the early hours, cutting through the calm of the morning like a sharp knife. Andrew's voice on the other end was tense, strained, and full of the kind of urgency that made John's stomach drop. The business had hit a serious snag, a financial setback, a deal that had seemed solid but now threatened to unravel everything they'd worked for. There was a gaping hole in the budget, an unplanned expense, and if it wasn't addressed quickly, the fallout would reach far beyond just one project. It could bring everything crashing down. John sat up in bed, heart pounding, his mind racing through the possible outcomes. The situation was dire. This wasn't some minor hiccup, this was a test, and Andrew was right in the middle of it. The weight of it all hit John like a wave, but something else was there too, a reluctance to step in. He could fix it, he knew that. He could handle the situation with one phone call, one swift decision. But this wasn't his battle anymore. It wasn't about doing what was best for the business, or even for him. It was about giving Andrew the chance to prove that he had truly learned what it meant to take responsibility. John hesitated. He could feel the familiar pull to step in to shield his son from the storm. But after everything they had been through, after the long months of rebuilding trust, John knew this was Andrew's moment. He had to stand on his own, even if the cost was high. On the other end of the line, Andrew was doing his best to keep calm, but John could hear the anxiety creeping into his voice. "I don't know what to do, Dad. This wasn't part of the plan. It's bad. We could lose everything." John breathed slowly into the phone, gathering his thoughts before he spoke. "You've got this, Andrew. Don't panic. You've been handling things on your own. Now you need to figure this out yourself. This is your test." It was a heavy, but necessary, weight to place on Andrew. John had to trust that his son could face the pressure without looking to him for a safety net. The silence on the phone was thick, as if Andrew were searching for the right words, trying to process the enormity of what his father had just said. After a long pause, Andrew spoke again, his voice quieter this time. I'm going to figure it out. I'll make the calls. I'll find a solution." John, though still uneasy, could hear the determination in his son's voice. It wasn't the desperation that once drove Andrew to act impulsively. It was something different. It was controlled, thoughtful, and most importantly, it was his decision. Over the next few hours, Andrew moved swiftly. He reached out to key investors, renegotiated contracts, and worked with the team to reallocate resources. There was no panicking, no asking for help from John, no shortcuts. Andrew was doing the hard work, facing the consequences of the situation head-on. John, still uneasy, watched the process from the sidelines, giving advice when asked but allowing Andrew to lead. The silence between them was a test in itself. As much as John wanted to step in and take control, he knew he had to let Andrew steer this ship. When Andrew finally called to report back, his voice was steadier. "We've got it under control. We've secured a new funding source and we've restructured the terms. It's not perfect, but we'll make it work. It's done." The weight that had settled on John's chest lifted slightly, though it was still there. His pride in his son's ability to handle the crisis was undeniable, but he didn't let it overwhelm him. There was still so much ground to cover, so many layers of trust yet to rebuild. As Andrew ended the call, John sat back in his chair, deep in thought. The outcome of this situation was still uncertain. There were always variables, always risks, but there was no denying the growth in Andrew. He had handled this with maturity, with a calmness that John hadn't seen before. Later that evening, as the family sat together, the tension in the air had lifted. They weren't celebrating yet, not fully. But there was a sense of change, a quiet understanding between father and son that their relationship had shifted. John, looking at Andrew, felt the weight of the moment. This was the final test, the moment that would either cement Andrew's place as a capable, independent adult or return them to the fractured past. John's pride was tempered by a caution that hadn't fully left him, but he knew, deep down, that this was a turning point. As the night drew to a close, the family gathered in silence. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, John felt a fragile sense of hope. The future wasn't set in stone, but they were moving forward, and that, for now, was enough. The morning air was crisp as Andrew stepped into the office, the familiar hum of the family business surrounding him. But today, it felt different. The weight of his past mistakes, the anger, the betrayal, all of it was still there, but lighter now, like a storm that had passed, leaving behind clear skies. John sat at his desk, his eyes on the latest reports, but when he saw his son enter, something shifted in his gaze. There was no hesitation this time, no guardedness. Just a quiet recognition of what had changed between them. Andrew had earned his place, earned this moment, not by avoiding mistakes, but by facing them, learning from them. It hadn't been an easy road. There had been weeks of doubt, of tentative steps and second chances. But now, as he looked at his father, he knew the road had finally brought them here. He had passed the final test. The trust John had once given him so freely was now something he had to prove he could handle, and he had done it. Not just by surviving the challenges, but by leading through them. "Morning, Dad," Andrew said, his voice steady, but there was a weight to the words. The weight of knowing that today was the day he would finally be allowed to take on more responsibility in the family business. John looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable for a moment, but then a small, approving nod. "Morning. I've been looking over the new projections," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm giving you more freedom to run the upcoming project. You've earned it." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. John had always been protective of the business, of the legacy he'd built. But now, he was allowing his son to steer the ship in ways he never had before. There was no safety net, no backup plan. This was Andrew's chance to truly prove himself, not just as his son, but as an equal in the business. Andrew felt a mix of pride and anxiety surge through him. This was the moment he'd been working for, the culmination of everything he had learned. And yet, even with the approval, there was still that undercurrent of uncertainty. The weight of responsibility was still fresh, the fear of failure still a shadow hanging over him. "I won't let you down, Dad," Andrew said, his voice quieter now but filled with sincerity. John's eyes softened just a little. "I know you won't. Just remember, this isn't about taking control. It's about taking responsibility." Andrew nodded, feeling the depth of those words. It was one thing to take control, to make decisions without thinking. It was another to own those decisions, to bear the consequences of them. That was what he had learned and what he now had to prove. The first few days were a blur of meetings, decisions, and late nights, but Andrew handled it with a calm precision that surprised even him. He was no longer the impulsive man he had been, rushing into things without considering the impact. Every choice was measured, every step deliberate, and with each small victory, he proved more and more that he had learned how to stand on his own. Samantha, who had watched this transformation unfold from the sidelines, could no longer stay quiet. One evening, as the family gathered around the dinner table, she raised her glass, a playful smile on her face. "I think we should all raise a toast to Andrew," she said, her voice light but filled with warmth, "for showing us that people can change." John's gaze flicked toward his son, a look of pride that spoke volumes. He had never expected this, never believed that Andrew could truly change. But now, as he saw his son take the reins and handle the responsibility that came with it, he felt a quiet satisfaction settle in his chest. It wasn't juice. Pride in his son's accomplishments. It was pride in the man Andrew had become. The family, once fractured and uncertain, was now moving forward together. The business was thriving, and more importantly, so were they. There was still work to be done, challenges ahead, but for the first time in years, they were working together as a unit, each member contributing to the greater whole. As Andrew sat back in his chair, the tension that had once defined his relationship with his father was finally gone. They weren't just father and son anymore. They were partners, equals. The years of hurt and betrayal had been replaced by something more solid, more enduring: trust. But as the evening wound down, and Andrew allowed himself to feel the weight of everything he had accomplished, he couldn't shake the feeling that the journey was far from over. He had come a long way, but there was always the chance that the past could catch up to him. The future was uncertain, and he knew that no amount of progress could change that. Still, for the first time, he felt that he was ready for whatever came next. And as the family shared a quiet moment together, it was clear that they were all, finally, ready to face the future together. The office was alive with energy that hadn't been there before. The hum of phones, the low murmur of conversations, the steady click of keyboards. It was a sound that reminded John of what they had built. Not just the business, but the relationship he now shared with Andrew. It wasn't perfect, and it hadn't been easy, but it had been earned. Together, they had weathered the storm, and now, as they worked side by side, it was clear that the future they were creating was stronger than anything they'd ever known. John watched his son across the room, the same man he had once feared would never live up to his potential, now leading a meeting with clients. Andrew stood with confidence, making decisions, guiding the team, speaking with authority. No longer a young man scrambling for approval, he was now a leader in his own right, someone who had earned not just his father's trust but his respect. It wasn't lost on John how far they had come. He saw the same determination in Andrew's eyes that he had once seen in his own, all those years ago when he first started building this company. The pride John had always hoped to feel for his son was now a quiet certainty. He had trusted Andrew, and Andrew had proven that trust wasn't just a fleeting notion, it was something he could uphold. They were building a thriving business, one that wasn't just financially successful but was grounded in the strength of their bond. And for the first time in years, the past seemed less like a weight that held them down and more like a foundation that had made them stronger. The lessons learned, the mistakes made, the forgiveness given, it had all led them here. The family gathered that evening in celebration, gathered around a table stacked with food, laughter, and the sense of something new. Samantha, who had always been the bridge between them, raised a glass. "To us," she said with a smile, her eyes glistening with the pride she had seen growing in her brother. "For the journey we've taken and the future we're building together." Andrew looked over at John, his gaze sincere. "To the future," he said, raising his own glass. There was no awkwardness between them, no hesitation. It felt right, the way they were now, the way their relationship had become not just about father and son, but about partners, equals. John took a long breath, letting the moment settle in. The years of tension, the anger, the betrayal, it felt like it belonged to someone else now. He had learned the hardest lesson of all. That trust, once broken, was not impossible to rebuild, but it took patience, understanding, and, most importantly, forgiveness. He had learned that letting go of the past didn't mean forgetting it, but using it as the stepping stone to something stronger. Andrew had earned his place at the table, not just in business but in their family. John could see that now. And though he had always been protective of the company, of the legacy he had built, he knew it was time to step back. Andrew had proven that he could handle responsibility on his own without needing constant oversight. This was his time, his opportunity to take the reins, and John would be there to guide him when needed. but he no longer had to do it alone. As the night wore on, the weight of their shared journey hung in the air, but it wasn't heavy anymore. It was a reminder of how far they had come. They weren't just a family recovering from the past. They were a family stronger than before, ready to face whatever the future had in store. John and Andrew sat together long after the others had left the table, speaking quietly about the plans ahead. There was no tension now, no unspoken distance. There was only a quiet certainty that, whatever came next, they could face it together. But even as they looked ahead, John couldn't shake the feeling that challenges still awaited them. They had overcome so much, but the future was always uncertain. And while the road ahead seemed brighter, they both knew that there were still hurdles to come. Yet for the first time they felt ready to face whatever came their way. And as John and Andrew exchanged a look, one filled with unspoken understanding, they both knew the future was theirs to shape together. The conference room buzzed with energy, a quiet hum of anticipation as John and Andrew sat side by side. The papers spread out before them were more than just numbers and projections. They were the foundation of something bigger. This wasn't just about business anymore. It was about creating a future, one that they could build together. John looked at his son, his eyes reflecting a sense of pride, but also something deeper, a quiet understanding that the road ahead was theirs to shape. Their bond had come a long way, from the tension and uncertainty of the past, to this point, where they could now plan for the next phase of their business together. Andrew, no longer the uncertain man he once was, sat with confidence. He had earned his place not through shortcuts or quick wins, but through hard work and determination. There was a calm in his demeanor, a surety that hadn't been there before. He was no longer the son trying to prove himself. Now he was an equal, John's partner. Andrew's leadership had become an integral part of the company's growth, and with each decision he made, John saw the growth not just of the business, but of his son. "I think this is it," John said, tapping the paper before him. "This is the next step. If we focus on expanding our reach, solidifying our partnerships, we can start making a bigger impact." Andrew nodded, his eyes scanning the documents, but there was no hesitation in his voice. "I agree. We've got the foundation now. It's time to build on it. I'll take the lead on this. I want to make sure we're setting the right tone as we grow." The weight of the words hung in the air. "I'll take the lead on this." John couldn't remember the last time he had heard those words from Andrew, without fear, without self-doubt. It was a moment of quiet victory for John. His son had grown into the leader he had always hoped he could be, and now John was finally ready to step back. For years, John had been at the helm of the business, making every decision, controlling every aspect of the operation. It had been his life's work, his legacy. But now he found himself at a crossroads, the moment of transition that would define the future. He had to trust that Andrew could handle it, not just the day-to-day, but the weight of the legacy he would one day inherit. John's hand rested on the edge of the table, fingers tapping lightly against the surface, but his mind was elsewhere, reflecting on the journey they had taken to get here. "This is what I worked for," he thought. To see Andrew not just succeed but flourish, to prove that their business could thrive under new leadership. The struggle, the pain of the past, it had all been worth it because Andrew had learned, had grown. And that was the real victory. As the meeting wrapped up, Andrew's words resonated. "We'll keep the momentum going. I'll make sure we're transparent with the team, bring them in on the vision, so we all move forward together." John couldn't suppress the small smile that tugged at his lips. His son had learned the most important lesson: growth, both personal and professional, was about collaboration. It wasn't about doing it all alone. It was about bringing people along for the journey, making sure they all thrived. Later that evening, the family gathered around the dinner table, their successes laid out in front of them. Samantha, though still adjusting to the changes in the family dynamic, looked around with a quiet sense of acceptance. She had always been the peacekeeper, the one who saw the potential for unity when everyone else saw conflict. Now, as she looked at her father and brother working side by side, something clicked for her. This is what balance looks like, she thought. This is what it means to grow together. The family wasn't perfect. They still had scars, still had moments of tension, but there was something undeniable in the air. A sense of unity, a sense of purpose. As the meal came to an end, John and Andrew stood together, both gazing out at the view from the window. The city sprawled beneath them, full of potential, full of promise. They weren't just father and son anymore. They were partners ready to pass on their legacy, not just to each other but to the next generation. The business would grow, the family would grow, and the future, while still uncertain, was theirs to shape. But even as they stood there, looking out at the world they had built, neither of them could shake the feeling that the road ahead would not be without its challenges. The past had taught them that growth never came without struggle, and as much as they had accomplished, they knew that the next phase of their journey was just beginning. The office was quieter than usual that evening, the last of the day's tasks already completed. John sat at his desk, eyes scanning the reports, but his mind was elsewhere. He couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him here, how far both he and Andrew had come, how much had changed between them. The distance that had once existed, the years of strained silence, of broken trust, now seemed like a distant memory. In its place was something more enduring: respect, understanding. A bond that had been tested and somehow had emerged stronger than ever. Andrew entered the office, his footsteps sure, his presence more grounded than it had been even a year ago. The tension between them, which had once weighed heavy in the air, was now just a faint shadow. They no longer circled each other in careful silence, but spoke openly, honestly. It was a relationship born of hard work and shared effort, built on the recognition of each other's strengths and the mutual respect they had forged through their struggles. "Dad, I was thinking," Andrew began, his voice steady, but filled with the kind of reflection only a man who had learned something deep could speak with. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" John looked up from the reports, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "We sure have," he replied. "I never thought we'd get here, but I'm proud of what we've built, and proud of you." Andrew's smile was quiet but genuine. The weight of his father's approval, once something he'd craved, now felt like a deep, solid foundation beneath his feet. He had earned it. They both had. The business was thriving, the foundation they had laid now a strong platform for future growth. They had navigated challenges, some financial, some personal, and had come out the other side more united, more capable than before. But what mattered most to John wasn't just the success of the company. It was the fact that he could finally see Andrew not as a boy, not as the son who had made impulsive mistakes, but as an equal, a partner. Andrew was more than capable of handling the responsibility. He was leading with wisdom, with a vision that went beyond just the next deal. He was building something lasting. That evening the family gathered together for dinner, just the four of them: John, Andrew, Lisa, and Samantha. There was no fanfare, no extravagant celebration. It was simple, but it was meaningful. They didn't need a grand gesture to mark the moment. They had already passed the hardest tests, and now they could simply enjoy what they had built. As they sat down together, laughter filling the room, John felt something stir within him. It wasn't just pride, it was a quiet sense of fulfillment. He had spent years worrying about the future, about how things would turn out. But now, watching Andrew take his place in the world, not just in the business but as a man, John knew that the future wasn't something to fear. It was something they would build together. Andrew, looking across the table at his father, felt a surge of gratitude he couldn't quite put into words. He had made mistakes, yes, but through it all, his father had never truly given up on him. John had been tough but fair, always pushing him to be better, even when it hurt. Now Andrew realized that everything his father had done, the tough love, the lessons learned the hard way, had been to prepare him for this. "I couldn't have done this without you," Andrew said, his voice sincere. "All the work, the decisions, the leadership, yeah, I've put in the effort, but you've shown me what it really means to lead, what it really means to be a leader, and I'm ready to take that forward." John didn't say anything immediately. He didn't need to. He simply looked at his son, his gaze full of understanding. "I'm proud of you, Andrew," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "You've earned it." As the evening wore on, they shared stories, talked about the future, and acknowledged how far they had come. It wasn't just the business that had grown, it was their relationship. They had rebuilt what had been broken, and in doing so, had created something new, a bond of mutual respect that had strengthened with time. Later that night, as John and Andrew stood side by the window, looking out at the city below, there was no need for words. The silence between them was comfortable, full of understanding. They had shared this journey together, and they both knew that it wasn't over yet. The legacy they were building wasn't just about the business. It was about the future they were shaping, the values they would pass down, the lessons they would continue to learn together. And as father and son stood side by side, they understood that their journey had shaped not only their business but their bond, a bond that would last for generations to come. But even in this moment of quiet satisfaction, they both knew that the road ahead, though uncertain, was one they would face together. The future was theirs.